Therefore, I welcome you once more to the library, where today we are going to discuss in brief the generalities of law and order in the realms of Jam'mar in this, our second entry in Series 3 of Intro to the Realms. Now I know my perceptive patrons as well as regular visitors of the library are already aware, but if you are a new guest to the library, hello and greetings. I am the recorder, and this will be but an introduction and overview of how law is handled within the realms. Further explorations in more detail will come in future, if there is sufficient interest, of course. With that out of the way, let us begin. First off, it should be noted that in general, the realms tend not to have overly complex laws when it comes to matters of a criminal nature. Assault, murder, and other overtly violent and damaging offenses tend to universally be assumed illegal. However, how each of those are defined can shift by some amount from sovereignty to sovereignty, as well as the possible remedies for each. In one, you might be clear of any charges if you make appropriate reparations to the victim, going so far as to pay for otherwise obtaining a means of resurrection in the case of an accidental murder charge. In another land, no amount will be able to stay the headsman's axe for those that commit such acts of barbarity. Crimes involving property, such as burglary, petty theft, or the like, are likewise treated in a direct manner, attempting to restore the victim's losses while discouraging further crime. Events of a more complex nature involving property, such as cases of fraud, various deceptive practices, and other white-collar crime, will often not have any laws on the books forbidding them. Instead, security for these types of transactions are generally provided by the use of oath binders, thus vastly reducing the scope and scale of this form of crime, far beyond levels otherwise expected. For those few that do still occur, the vast majority will have involved more violent or egregious crimes, and those shall be the focus of any prosecution. While the details may differ, the majority of the realms function under common sense rules of law and order, with direct citizen resolution for many crimes being the norm, outside of larger cities that have an active policing force. In general, most population centers will have at least a few deputies under the direction of sheriff or constable, and they most often serve the purpose of simple peace officers, breaking up bar fights and taking the more uncooperative and violent ones to confinement while they sleep it off. While generally more than capable enough to deal with all the common issues that are to occur in such locales, they are often easily outmatched by larger collectives of criminals, bandit gangs, or the like. In these situations, it is often the case that the hunters will be called on for aid, and if not licensed hunters themselves, then local coin hunters, and as a last resort, an open call for adventurers will be made. There may or may not be the presence of a judge to hear cases immediately, and many times it will be an official that needs to travel to the village, hamlet, or town in question, as they serve many such communities, since the demand for judges is not consistent in any one of them. Alternatively, and quite commonly in the wild realms and other lawless lands, many population centers will see their elders or other ruling bodies serve this function, and these tend to make all efforts to be fair and just, for they are just as invested in the safety and prosperity of their home and community as any other, while possessing local knowledge that could serve as the key to many of the cases before them. Cases tend to be heard either outdoors or in public halls. Of course, this does vary by culture and sovereignty, but those nations that are members of the Council of Inter-Sovereignty Affairs, abbreviated to CISA from now on, are required by charter to have a minimum form of reviewable process for their legal actions accessible to the hunters. However, this tends not to be an issue for CISA members, as they usually already have such systems in place long before being of enough political weight to seek CISA membership in the first place. This decentralized and hands-on approach for keeping the peace tends to be the norm across most of the realms, both CISA member and Wild Realm alike. The biggest exception to this is that of major city-states and larger cities within major nations, such as national capitals. It is here where things tend to become more complex and complicated, as the larger economic base such a locale provides also provides it a magnitude more opportunities for criminal enterprises, such as loan sharking, art fabrications, racketeering, and many other complex and often violent ways for the unscrupulous to make a living on the fringes of a fat city or capital. In such places, and to a lesser extent, the wider realms, there are two major forces that aid in keeping law and order as the rule of the street, officially, and one very unofficial but equally effective one. First off, we will have the local police. In cities, this is most often a larger force of trained officers, quite frequently soldiers or former soldiers, and they are led by practitioners of law enforcement, seasoned and experienced. In such places, investigation work is not only possible, but it is a regularly performed task, unlike in the less populated areas where there is not enough need to justify having trained investigators just lying around. For many in these cities, the peace is enforced by men patrolling the streets and ensured by the diligent pursuit of the truth by brilliant investigators. Secondly, we have the hunters, who will often be contracted by citizens for investigations or by rulers or officers of all kinds to serve a number of tasks. These include, but are not limited to, investigations requiring esoteric or rare knowledge, prisoner transport or capture, and can include the execution of various bounties for those found guilty and fleeing justice. Hunters serve to shore up any shortages in these essential tasks in maintaining order, while generally being viewed as neutral and unbiased in the execution of these contracts. This, of course, does include the apprehensions of individuals who have fled to other jurisdictions, where their status as hunters will allow them to go generally unaccosted after capturing their target, even if it involved a violent and messy capture. By simple acceptance of the job, the underlying judgment for the contract will have been reviewed by the hunters and found appropriately actionable. This, along with the reputation of the hunters, goes some way in easing tensions that may otherwise from what amounts to a violent kidnapping. They also serve smaller communities by taking contracts for tasks such as dealing with those threats that are too much for the local sheriff and deputies, often bringing their overwhelming force relative to the general threat present, and thus discouraging further predations for quite some time. The final force that aids in the maintenance of order and law in the realms is, ironically, the underworld of the various criminal organizations that span the realms. Each understand that all too well that if crime and disorder were to rise too greatly or too quickly, the results would be devastating for all those involved. These organizations take the forms of thieves' guilds, cabals of assassins, smuggler rings, and many, many more. Each group interfacing with each other via a separate entire organization of neutral middlemen, and each responsible for keeping their own operations from evoking the wrath of the law or powers even higher. These groups self-police stringently and punish any threat to the greater underworld harshly and quickly. It is known that both the hunters and many local officials will often have backroom deals with these organizations, trading leniency on minor crimes of its members for cooperations on matters of a more significant nature. Quite often, criminals that get too greedy, or worse, too disruptive, will often find themselves in compromising situations and then quickly off to prison or worse, if they ignore the warnings of their peers and threaten the security of their mutual businesses. Incarceration in the realms, again, does vary from nation to nation, but most do have some form of long-term prison for the most dangerous or persistent of criminals, as well as those serving sentences longer than a few weeks, as many towns just lack the room to hold prisoners for that duration of time. The quality of the facilities in question tends to vary depending on the nation and their thoughts on how such places should be. Regardless of the quality, most tend to be nasty, violent, and dark places. And as such, punishments that send offenders to these places are generally avoided in lieu of community service or compensation as much as can be reasonably done. However, it is an unfortunate and irrefutable fact that some prisoners can only be safely contained, and they have no real hope of redemption. But they have not committed crimes worthy of death. Thus, the realm's needs for prisons will continue to exist. Speaking of death and executions, while many, if not most nations, do practice capital punishments for high crimes, murder, and mass devastation and destruction, beyond these, there are few crimes that will end at the chopping block as a rule. Of course, this is depending on the nation, but among most Kaisa nations, it is seen as a better alternative to enact banishment or any other of myriad choices of punishment before actually killing the offender for crimes that don't rise to these heights, as it is figured that there is somewhere that they could probably live a normal life, or at the very least in the wild realms where they are not a threat to the citizen of the nation in question. Also recognized in this stance is the fact that many realms have indeed been saved on more than one occasion by those that would otherwise be seen or classified as criminals. So, prison or banishment is often considered the pragmatic course of action for all but the most severe of criminals. Returning to the law and moving on to the topic of contraband or otherwise forbidden goods. Again, with a few general exceptions, this tends to be on a nation-by-nation and a case-by-case basis, often aligning with cultural or religious doctrine. However, slavers and dealers of the most destructive drugs are on constant guard for their operations, as these are nearly universally considered high crimes by most Kaisa-aligned governments, and is generally punishable by death. In a setting with such advanced magical and mundane methods of healing treatments, the level of danger a drug must present to be added to this list is extreme and generally universally recognized. Within an individual nation, the lists of contraband material are normally kept fairly short, as there are few items typically worthy of the effort to prohibit in such a manner. Most commonly restricted items are things capable of wanton or wild-scale destruction and devastation, such as starship-grade mass drivers or other planet-killing ordnance. Magical or otherwise created doomsday weapons also tend to make the list, but often even this is merely limited to weapons of a less than obvious nature, such as diseases, plagues, and other mass destructive weapons. The ready availability of travel, as well as the presence of the wild realms and lawless lands, allows for contraband and its restriction to be often really a minor issue, as the deals for such goods may occur in towns, but the goods will never enter the sovereign territory of the nation, thus keeping both the nation safe from the contraband goods and the dealer safe from reprisals. The underworld networks of crime lords and others also ensure that nothing that is likely to bring too much attention to themselves is going to be permitted to happen without swift and brutal reprisal, again ensuring the betterment of the populace as a whole by this self-regulation. From a sheriff chasing pickpockets, to hunters capturing and returning the accused, and finally, the criminals that enforce upon their own, on their own. Justice in the realms and how it's served can be a varied and intricate thing, but it is nonetheless an effort that is rigorously maintained amongst the various stratas of the many cultures and nations of the realms of Jam'mar. The punishment of those that violate its principles aim to be just, measured, and practical, and with the excess tools available to do so, generally succeeds in this aim. All of this with the goal of allowing the citizenry of the realms the greatest possible freedoms while protecting them as best able, and doing the utmost to restore those that fall prey to ruffians or other ne'er-do-wells. With this basic entry on the law and its presence, function, and application within the realms now at its end, I hope you have a better understanding of how it is viewed and enforced. As always, my perceptive patrons, new guests, and regular visitors, I thank you for your time and your interest as we continue our exploration of Jam'mar and her realms in this Series 3 of Intro to the Realms. Until you next make your way back to the library for another entry, I have been, as always, the Recorder, and I will see you on your return. Till then, by the 9 and 4, be well, take care of yourselves and each other. If you'd like to contribute to the further exploration and explanation of the realms, please consider leaving a comment, a like, and sharing the video around. I read all the comments and make efforts to reply to each. Thank you for helping to grow the channel, and know I look forward to each and every one of your comments. Other methods of support can be found in the channel's description. Thank you for watching.